Shocking revelations of a child sexual abuse scandal.
People don't even know what grooming is.
As she was getting older, they were less interested because they like the younger schoolgirls.
I joined the police in 1997.
Because they can make more money with them.
I couldn't believe what I saw.
In Pakistan and Islam, man is master of the woman.
Actually been drugged and I was laying in the bed.
A woman is like a servant or semi-slave.
You have to be numb. You have to be numb, you know, not to have sympathy for these girls.
And there was different men coming into the room and having sex with me. But I was awake and I knew what was happening, I just couldn't move.
It is in towns such as Oldham, Rotherham, Rochdale or Telford, impoverished, economically frail, where the most significant child sexual abuse scandal took place.
Shocking revelations of a child sexual abuse scandal.
Thousands, if not tens of thousands of girls became victims here in the north of England, prey to rape and trafficking rings. This all goes under the term of grooming, and before we delve into this phenomenon, let's give a voice to the victims. We meet Samantha, Liz, and Jane, who share their story.
My name is Jane. I am a survivor of grooming gangs. The abuse started with me when I was 12 years old.
I'm Liz and I'm a survivor of historical child sexual exploitation and part of the scandal, what is it, the UK. I was 14 when this started.
I'm Samantha, I'm a survivor. I was sexually assaulted and raped in 24 hours at 12-year-old.
Well, when I was 12 years old, I met a friend in school. She was 3 years older than me. And she introduced me to one man. He started buying me. He bought me a phone to start with and told me to hide it from my parents. And then he's just giving me money for nothing and being nice. That went on for a few months. Then he started introducing me to his friends. Basically telling me that I owed him something and I had to do these things. So basically I come across lots of men being passed around and stuff like that. A lot of my abuse took part in Oldham. It was taxi drivers, takeaway owners, shisha bars, in cars, in houses, council houses. And even on the streets.
I was just on the street. I decided not to go to school and I was just on the street and she picked me up from just outside school. You know, this lady was known to the police, the local authority, and they decided not to do anything. I was around 14 when my abuse started and it was facilitated originally by a woman who then, as time went on, decided to lock me in her property and bring gangs of men.
Also, there was one incident where I'd actually been drugged and I was laying in the bed and there was different men coming into the room and having sex with me. But I was awake and I knew what was happening, I just couldn't move.
I was in a churchyard drinking where a man had asked to borrow a lighter. I went over to him and he sexually groped me. And that triggered me to know that that was not acceptable and that needs to be reported to the police. So then I went to the police station where I went to the police officer and said, I've just been sexually assaulted, I want to report it. They said, come back when you're sober. There was 2 men behind me who intervened and said, we can give you a lift if you need it. Where the officer said that's a good option, go with them. I went with the 2 men who then sexually abused me around the town. They dropped me off. I then walked up the street trying to seek some help to get home.
The perpetrators make you think that you need to be reliant on them, that they're the only people that will help you and things like that, but it's totally different. It's how they get into the child's mind. People don't want to hear the ins and outs. All I can describe it as is it's your worst nightmare times 100. The isolation, the brainwashing. You know, this just isn't about raping and abusing children. It's about the whole psychological part of it as well.
It was a very built-up area. It was very dark. A lot of cars. There was a lady, I believe she was Polish, who couldn't speak very well, but she stuttered with the words and she was unable to understand what I was trying to say. And then a man appeared at the door of the garden she was standing at, and she said, speak to him. And he invited me in.
Well, the first man that I met, he was extremely nice to me. At first, he gained my trust. He gave me things I thought he was my friend. And then, after a bit, he started becoming extremely abusive and nasty and forceful. He threatened to kill my parents. He threatened to come to my house.
The atmosphere were cold and calculating. It were always that she was up to something, you know, to put me in danger, but how she worked was that she'd only have one victim in there at a time.
We went straight upstairs into one of the bedrooms, and I remember a computer being in there, and a bed. That's all I can remember.
Absolutely filthy. You know, bed sheets as curtains, mattresses on the floor, contained very, very little furniture. It was disgusting.
And he invited me in, took me upstairs and sexually abused me. After that, he advised me to go to the main road, and that was the way to get home. And from there, walking up, a taxi pulled up and offered me a lift, which I grew up getting into taxis and thought it was safe to do so. And from there, he, instead of driving me home, he drove me to his property, and a further 4 men was with him, and they abused me all night.
There was one incident where I was actually caught with my pants around my ankles by police officers, and they actually arrested me for prostitution. I was only 13 years old.
Samantha was also 14 years old when she tried to report sexual abuse to the police in Oldham. Instead of helping her, the officers handed her back to her rapists.
Well, back then, we were more victim blamed, that we were children off the rails, that it was our fault in getting into these situations. We was never believed. But now there are telltale signs on how to see that in a child. But back then it was a lot harder, even though he was crying out for help and saying, look, this is going on. We just wasn't believed.
In Liz's case, also an older woman was involved. She drugged girls with alcohol, rented out an apartment where members of the Pakistani abuse ring would come to rape her. One of her perpetrators, Oscar Bustan, was sentenced to 9 years in prison in 2018. Liz was only 14 at that time.
There's a big stereotype within England and probably around the world, to be honest, that we were all from broken homes, we didn't have any parents, the list is endless. But that stereotype's just a stereotype. There were many of us from normal families, working parents, not from the stereotypical, you know, poor families. It wasn't like that for myself and many others. So I went to secondary school. I didn't quite fit in, and that's when my vulnerability started, and I wasn't going to school, and that's when I met the lady.
Jane moved to Oldham at the age of 12. She befriended an older woman who introduced her to older men. One bought her a phone, others gave her alcohol, marking the start of a downward spiral.
At one point, I was actually told that it would have been too mentally exhausting on my mental health to stand up in court, and it wasn't a good thing for me at the time. Also, I went to the police 2, 3, 4 times to tell them what had happened, and nothing was done. So I stopped going to the police then, because nothing had been done.
Another perspective that is striking to us, that of the parents being helpless as their children fall victim to grooming. Near Manchester, we meet Marlon, who lived through 4 years of hell as his daughter Scarlett, aged 14, turned away, began using drugs, and found new friends who turned out to be part of an abuse ring.
It actually started when she was 13. The first instance was Halloween 2018. She was attacked by a gang of 17 youths in the bus station. And that was basically the start of it. Cutting the story short, she finished up knocking around with this gang because she was frightened of them. And they kept intimidating her. It was easier to be friends with them than enemies. So that's where the grooming started. So there was a much older female who knocked around with this gang who befriended her. And she was the one who started to groom her. She started going missing. One night here, one night there, or coming in really late on a school night, like 2 o'clock in the morning. She had money on her. So these, for me, were massive, massive red flags. And then it escalated. So from going missing a night here, a night there, she started going missing for weeks. So that was the first step. Then the step after that, and this happens so much, alcohol, cannabis, money. She's using lots and lots of drugs because they keep her intoxicated. So when I am getting her back home, she's a very conscious young girl as far as her presentation. And she'll be coming home malnourished, looking like a homeless person. It was just terrible. The clothes she'd been wearing probably for the last 3-4 weeks. And I'm getting her back home, trying to sort her out, getting food in her. And then as quick as I'm sorting her, in a couple of days, she's gone again. Because the pull, and I always said this to social services and the police, because I'd be criticised as a father. It's not push. This is pull. With Scarlett, it was a white British female who groomed her, but she was grooming her for the gang, which came pretty quick, and she was passed around in some ways to different types of gangs. You know, one week might be a gang in Rochdale, and next week it could be a gang in Oldham. So on one occasion when she was going missing for weeks at a time, the police returned her to my house about 3 o'clock in the morning. And I asked the police where she'd been, where they found her, because she'd been missing for a while. And they said they found her on an industrial estate in Mosley with two men and the female groomer. So I was like, brilliant, this is great. So you've arrested him? No, we just brought Scarlett home. Then I realised it was too coincidental, a car had been following me, even when I went to the shops. And I was outside my property changing the CCTV about a new CCTV system. I'm on my ladders outside the house, and I could see this car at the top of the street. And as I came down the ladders, he pulled over on my drive and went, "Are you Marlon West?" And I said to him, "What if I am?" So he said, "You really need to watch yourself." So then I telephoned Scarlett, she was out at the time, and she said, "It's that guy who's been following me around." And then about a week after that, I came downstairs in the morning, and there's a letter on the floor. And the letter was really, really strange. It looked like it had been written by a child. It had my name on it. There was a lot of sellotape all over it. So I basically picked it up really carefully. I didn't open it, and I put it in a sealed bag, because police was involved at that point, and I passed it over to the police. So they were really concerned, and they put an alert on my property. And then again, about a week after that, Scarlett was in the bedroom, came downstairs and was hysterical, because he sent her a video of him shooting a gun out of the car and saying, "If you don't meet me, this is what I'm going to do to your dad."
Before the grooming could escalate even further, the police arrested the man who had threatened Marlon with death. The threats triggered more chaos, including a raid on the grooming house, that shook the teenager into a moment of reckoning. Today, her bond with the father has begun to heal. She lives close by him and is slowly starting a professional career. But the wounds from that dark chapter run deep.
You know, she's got complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's getting worse as she's getting older, because she's realising more how bad it is. So I get phone calls 2-3 o'clock in the morning from her, because she's had a nightmare and she's really upset. She's really, really anxious going out on her own in case she sees people who've raped her, or part of the gang, or the groomer. She's terrified. This destroys families. It's not just the girl, it's the whole family. So I have very little social contact with old friends because of it. I was having a relationship, and that soon ended, because I'm driving around in the middle of the night, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I'm grumpy, I'm worrying.
To delve deeper into their profile, we reach out to Maggie Oliver. She was a detective in the Greater Manchester area and is recognized as an expert on the field of grooming.
They're not Asian men. They are predominantly Pakistani Muslim men. They're not from China or Japan or Thailand. They're predominantly from Pakistan, sometimes from Afghanistan or maybe Iraq. But they're very organized networks. You know, that community has links to lots of different places within the country. So that's where the trafficking of these children comes in. Somebody will pick a child up, befriend them, groom them in Rochdale, say, or Rotherham. And then as they get them more under their control, they might take them over to Bradford or Keighley or Birmingham. So they are extremely vulnerable to somebody who comes in who, first of all, pretends to be their friend. You know, it might be a younger boy, it might be a 18-year-old who will make friends with a 11-year-old, 12-year-old, take them for a pizza, take them out in the car, buy them a little bit of jewellery, buy them 6, give them a drink, and then over a period of time, it escalates, and the child might end up having sex or being raped, basically, by that friend, and then that friend begins to then introduce them to his friends, and they end up in a house where I've spoken to children who were in one room with 20 men and one child, and all of those men will be raping that child. But to cope, the child will be given a load of alcohol. So they're very drunk, they're on their own, they're frightened, they are powerless. And I've seen, some horrendous, I've dealt with some horrendous cases of, kids being taken up into the middle of the moors in the pitch black on their own, raped by 3 men in a car. Being driven, I've been taken to these locations that are, the pitch black, there's no buildings for miles. I remember going over a little hill, and if you were there is nobody that will save you. Those little kids are terrified. They're not going to say no. So they're raped. And then I remember one case where the girl basically kicked off afterwards, and the men in the car threw her out on the top of the moors with no shoes on in the middle of winter, barely any clothes on, and just abandoned her. And she was picked up by the police, who actually took her home and told her father that he needed to get a grip of her, even though she said what had happened. I know of another case where a girl had been raped repeatedly in a flat. She managed to call the police because what they'd done when this girl had said she wasn't going to cooperate, they'd got a spoon and heated the spoon up on the cooker and burnt her with it. The police came, and the men said she'd done it herself, and they believed those men.
What the former detective is saying is an accusation that we encounter again and again when investigating the scandal. The police, but also social services and politicians, protected the perpetrators for years, even decades, out of the fear of being accused of racism or Islamophobia.
I worked in serious crime, and then in 2004, I was asked to go on a case that became known as Operation Augusta in Manchester. That was my first experience of what is now called grooming gangs. I worked on it for a year and a half. We'd identified 100 paedophiles. We had dozens of child victims. And my husband was terminally ill, and I went off work to look after him in his final weeks. When I came back to work about 3 months later, the whole case had been completely shut down. It had been buried. Nobody charged. The rapists allowed to continue with their lives. The children just abandoned. And I couldn't believe what I saw. I couldn't get any answers. I tried, but there was nobody who would want to listen. I had no paperwork, no evidence, but I knew that it was wrong. In 2010, I was asked to join an identical job, really, in Rochdale. I was given cast iron guarantees that there would not be a repeat of Augusta, and I agreed to join that job. And we had there was a lot of things that happened, but one of the things that happened, there was a little girl who was 12 when her rape began, and one of her abusers got her pregnant when she was just 13. What had happened, a few months before I was approached, there was a review in the property system at Greater Manchester Police, and the officer reviewing found a fetus in the property system that had been seized without that little girl's knowledge, without her mum's knowledge. and it had just sat there for 2 years. So I was approached and asked whether I would go and tell the family and also gain their consent to get DNA from this fetus. And then suddenly the mood changed within the investigation. And I was told without any conversation that the bosses had changed their mind and they were going to drop the older sister, Amber, in the drama, 3 girls. And also that the man, the 43-year-old Pakistani Muslim man who had got Ruby pregnant, and we had the fetus and DNA, and we knew he was responsible for making her pregnant. He wasn't going to be charged with rape. He was just going to be charged with conspiracy to commit sexual activity with a child. I walked off the job.
What the former detective is saying here is an accusation that we encounter again and again when investigating the scandal. The police, social services, and politicians protected the perpetrators for years, even decades, out of the fear of being accused of racism and Islamophobia. As thousands of white British girls fell victim to Pakistani trafficking rings, officials protected the abusers out of misplaced deference. Tameside Borough lies close to Manchester, between Oldham, Rotherham and Rochdale, the epicenters of the scandal. Yet here local politics has refused to investigate for years, a scandal according to Tory MP Liam Billington.
The borough that doesn't have anything is supposedly Tameside. However, in a council presentation, we was told that there are 30 cases of child sexual exploitation that happen in the borough every single quarter. So that's 120 a year. Now, there's been a assurance review, as it's called, in Oldham, because between 2008 and 2018, there was over 502 cases of child sexual exploitation. So if Tameside's got 120 a year, that means that Tameside over a 10-year period has had 1,200 cases. And that's when I wanted to delve further into that information to see what the extent of the problem is in the borough. And we had a presentation on the council, which gave the figures of 30 every quarter. And so as a councillor, you're there to scrutinise. And so I started asking questions off the back of that. We're told that as councillors, we're corporate parents, which means we're responsible for the safety and well-being of all the children in the borough. And with that, I asked, well, if there's 30 cases which are happening every quarter, then where is this happening within Tameside? And the council didn't want to acknowledge that. Within the report, they didn't even make any mention of Muslim males, Pakistani, Bangladeshi men. So I really pressed on that. And the police detective who was present at the meeting said that the areas where it was happening was within Hyde, where there was takeaways, and in central Ashton with taxi drivers. And based on those job functions are predominantly carried out by Bangladeshi and Pakistani males. But the council don't want to acknowledge this due to political correctness, fear of being called racist.
Cover-ups and concealment are all too familiar to Sammy Woodhouse. She is from Rotherham, where at the age of 14, she fell prey to grooming with a 24-year-old man who abused her and was a notorious criminal. She recounts how she slammed into a wall of silence.
It was in about 2012 when I started to actually recognise that I was a victim of exploitation. And a family member phoned me and they said, you know, somebody wants to speak to you about taking legal action against Rotherham Council and South Yorkshire Police for what you went through. And I just wasn't interested in speaking about it at this point. I was really suicidal. I was still getting threats from him and his family. And I just wanted it, I suppose, to go away. But I walked into a petrol station and I saw a newspaper and it said something along the lines of 54 girls had been befriended by 3 Asian brothers. And it was very important how that was worded. If it would have been along the lines of 54 girls were exploited, I would have walked straight past it because I didn't know what exploitation was, even though I'd lived it. But I knew that article was about him and his brothers because he was so well known in the town, and it's no exaggeration when I say that he did run that town. I contacted a journalist at the Times newspaper called Andrew Norfolk, and I gave him all my evidence, and we published the story. They called me Jessica, and it was my story that commissioned the Alexis J report, which now has proven that there was a minimum of 1,400 children in my hometown that was groomed, abused, raped, tortured, trafficked, murdered. We were criminalised, impregnated and blamed. But I also opened the criminal investigation, which is now known as the biggest investigation in British history, in regards to child abuse. So if there's one thing, I'm proud of with everything that I've done is, when I spoke out, it actually achieved something. And it gave people like me a chance to get criminal justice and to get our truth out there, of what had happened, because it was just so horrific what had happened to us. And that's when I became an activist. But if you look at overall how much we've been failed, what it tells us is that we have a system and people running that system that just don't care about us. And they are directly involved in this. So what evidence has shown is not only police officers, social workers, charity workers, politicians, members of the royal family have all been linked to exploiting children. There was many people involved. This weren't just one person giving out orders. We're talking about, the entire system that failed us. I was called a lovesick teenager, his mistress, a packy shagger. We got blamed for what we was going through, and there was children as young as 10 and 11 years old that were going through this, and they blamed us. But what in Rotherham it showed was that majority of the offenders were Pakistani Muslim men, and majority of the victims were white, non-Muslim female children. So there was a lot of people that were afraid to be called racist or Islamophobic. And I remember, when it was happening, and he would, if he, kind of got into any trouble, he would say, well, I'll just play the race card. Well, the truth is, my hometown didn't allow this to happen. Every single town and city in the UK allowed this to happen. This isn't a Rotherham problem, as we know. It's happening all the way throughout the country. And I remember, in fact, recently, I shared an article where it said a girl had slept with 100 Asian men. No, she didn't. She was raped.
The grooming scandal is widespread all over the country. While some cities are well known, there are now over 50 locations affected, from predominantly Muslim cities like Bradford to more wealthy areas such as Oxford and Cambridge. And one thing stands out: although there were British, Romanian or Somali grooming gangs, a big number of the perpetrators in these scandals are Muslim Pakistanis. A Quillette study revealed that more than 80% of convicted offenders belong to this ethnic group. In all the towns, Pakistanis are significantly overrepresented when it comes to grooming, sometimes by a factor of 10. And in Rotherham, where Liz, Sammy and thousands of other girls were groomed, it's estimated that 1 in every 73 men of the Pakistani community was involved in these crimes. We meet Imtiaz Mahmood, who himself migrated from Pakistan to England in the 1980s. He's now an atheist and understands the underlying structures and sees a connection to Islam.
First of all, I like to go in the background. 50, 60 years ago, British needed labor for their textile industry. So from a particular area in Pakistan side of the Kashmir is a city called Mirpur. So they imported the labor from there. And they came and worked here, and they were less educated than average Pakistanis. Average Pakistani per capita schooling is only 4 years if you look at whole of Pakistan, so not educated at all. And Pakistani curricular and society is they have high intensity of religiosity. So when they came here and they did work, and then they became jobless as textile industry finished or declined. So they went into corner shops and other whatever job was available to them. At that time, England itself did not have a great economy, and people up north, because they also became jobless with the collapse of textile industry. So whenever they live together in a ghetto or a Pakistani majority area or Muslim majority area, they make like their own rules and their system of living.
What kind of man are they? What kind of professions do they have? Where do they come from? How religious are they? Maybe you could give us a glance at the profile of the perpetrators.
In Pakistan, being a conservative society, they cannot meet girls. You can't talk to girls. There are no clubs, nothing. Even the schools are segregated from the area where they came. Boys' schools are separate and girls' schools are separate. So they have no experience of talking to the girls. So in this scenario, when the grooming started, they wanted to mix up with their own age women. Now these women were independent women making their own money. And so they were not compatible with them, because in Pakistan and Islam, man is master of the woman. A woman is like a servant or semi-slave. She does what the man, husband, father, brother tells them. They have come from this culture. Pakistan was a huge drug exporter. From Afghanistan, drugs came to Pakistan. So when they went out of textile jobs, drugs have huge profit margin, so they had drugs. And the profit was good, so they had more money than the local British girls or people. So they put them on drugs. And then other than drug retail, prostitution became their earning.
The grooming scandal took place in smaller towns of the north, such as Rochdale, Rotherham, Oldham. What is there specific about those towns that make grooming happening, especially there?
Immigrants in general, and Muslims in particular, they buy houses where other Muslims are living. So eventually the British leave that area and the prices fall, and more Pakistanis or Muslims, they gang together. So everywhere they live in smaller groups and capture that area. It's like conquest. And as time passed, they conquered more and more areas. Now there are 1,800 mosques, which are from where Islam spreads. Those are their forts. Police can't go in. They have everything there. Maybe they even have arms stored there, waiting for a mutiny or whatever. And that is where they are mentally become conquerors, that British are bad, these are bad people and we are good people, and we have to conquer them. They impose their own culture. So all these Muslim immigrants in the West are capturing the country for Islam without firing a bullet. So they are invading this culture and putting Islamic culture or Sharia law there. These are all conquerors. Still jihad is going on, only tactics have been changed.
There is significant proof that these acts were sometimes religiously justified and stemmed from motives that reject the white majority society and British culture. Here are some examples. The details of these crimes are horrific and gut-wrenching, and it leaves us asking, how could this happen? The first grooming cases surfaced as early as in the 1980s and 90s. Media reports, investigations, whistleblowers, and outrage on social media followed. Yet it feels as an entire nation allowed a generation of young girls to be systematically sexually abused. To make sense of this, we head to London to meet journalist David Atherton, who has tracked the grooming scandal for years and sees it as a failure of multiculturalism.
Now, if the roles were reversed, where you have white men, 20s, 30s, 40s, whatever age you are, raping Muslim girls, in their teens, they would be hell to pay in this country. It would be wall-to-wall BBC, wall-to-wall Guardian. We would never hear the last of it. You have to be numb. Not to have sympathy for these girls. I don't know whether you know the case of the girl who was she had her anus artificially inflated, and she was penetrated by 4 men at the same time. That was in Oxford. And do you know what? I can obviously send you a link. After 7 people were jailed, they would give us some quite hefty sentences. 14, 15 years. There's a moderate imam called Dr. Taj Hargay who commented on the case, and he actually said the imams at the local mosque in Oxford actually encouraged the congregation, the men, to go out there and abuse and rape the girls because they wore sleeveless dresses and short skirts. Promoting multiculturalism has been one of Britain's big mistakes. You have to have a common culture, a common language, a common creed. We don't have to be identical people of each other, but there must be some basic things that are here. For example, if you look at the polls, something like between 23 and 38% of British Muslims would prefer to live under Sharia law rather than secular law. These people just aren't integrating. 20% of women in the British Muslim community can't speak a word of English. Obviously, just on the same theme is probably the vast majority of Muslims in this country obviously condemn what goes on. But what we have in this country is we have the extremist, as I say, I've used the phrase before, the extremist tail wagging the moderate dog. Very, very few people across the whole society will stand up to the extreme elements of Islam.
In 2025, grooming is back in the spotlight, and the catalyst is none other than Elon Musk. With a flurry of tweets, he's turned the world's attention to the political failures. Since then, politicians have been discussing the issues, and at the heart of it, there is the burning question, Will there be a national inquiry?
Behind what happened. Now, I might be right, I might be wrong, but doesn't the country deserve a full, open national inquiry?
The fact that grooming was tolerated for decades speaks to a catastrophic failure of the British state. It exposes a society that sacrifices its youngest, most vulnerable members on the altar of multicultural romanticism. This is a society that collapses in plain sight.